hopefully this is the talk you plan to come here for. Is the New Testament reliable? Big question mark, isn't it? I want to start by introducing you to some people. A Muslim, a Buddhist, and an Odin worshiper walk into the room. I know you're already laughing because you're expecting the punchline. But actually, this is how I was first introduced to three people who later became my friends. Their names were, these are not them, their names were Nabil, Zach, and Daniel. And these three young men were studying at university and had come along at the invitation of one of my other friends to have some debate and discussion about who Jesus was, whether God exists, is the New Testament reliable? And they've been having some of these debates on campus, and they came to this group to have some more thorough debates on that. And the group that I was part of at that time was led by Mike Lycona at the top, who some of you might have heard of. David Wood was also a member of this group as well, and David has got an interesting story in his own right. And the Muslim who came to the group is known to some of you as Nabil Qureshi. We've got some of his books out on the bookstall. But when I first met Nabil and these others, they were wholly committed to other faiths other than Christianity. But here they were open to having a dialogue. See, they liked the idea of the person of Jesus who's described in the Bible, but they had been steeped in this sea of knowledge that said that book is not trustworthy. Let me just tell you about some of where that thinking comes from. See, first of all, some of you may be old enough to remember when the movie The Da Vinci Code came out, starring Tom Hanks. Now, the movie was based around a book by the same name. The book and its title purported that everything recorded in it was thoroughly researched and presented as true as discovered in the research. And the book made a whole lot of claims about the origin of the New Testament and about who Jesus was and what he did and how he lived his life and how he went on after the record of the New Testament to go marry Mary Magdalene and go raise a family in France. And the movie makes lots and lots of outrageous claims that have been purportedly thoroughly researched. But that's sort of the popular level argument that's helped instill this idea that the New Testament is not reliable. At the scholarly level, there's been a lot more research actually going on, real research, conducted by people like this gentleman, Mr. Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a professor of New Testament studies at Duke University, and he probably best represents some of the case against the resurrection of Jesus and the case against the New Testament as a whole. And I'm going to try to summarize his argument as he presents it, just so you can understand where he's coming from. He says that when we want to examine any historical document, we need to weigh up the evidence and see what it can tell us. First thing we want is lots of contemporary accounts that are close to the time of the events. We want lots of them. We want them to be independent of one another. We also want them to corroborate one another, so we can see that they're not exactly copies of each other, but are truly independent versions of the historical events that they purport to account. And we want them not biased towards the subject. Well, this sounds like a pretty good place to start. Let's see. Let's just take his argument just a little bit further. This is the criteria he wants to use to examine any historical documents. Now, when we come to examining the Gospels, the four biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as historical documents, what are some of the things that we discover about them? First off, when were they written? Well, best case is 30 years after the resurrection of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and some of them probably 65 years or more. Some people even put them out to almost 100 years later. The vast majority of scholars still 30 to 65 years after the events. Quite a long time, isn't it? none of the Gospels that we have are actually signed. We don't know who wrote them. So we don't have any eyewitness accounts. We just have these books that showed up, unsigned, that purport to tell us about these events. Where did the stories come from? If these weren't written down until 30 or 65 years after the events, where did the stories come from? Well, obviously, they must have been in oral circulation before that time period. And what happens to oral reports when they're in circulation? Have any of you ever played this game where someone has a phrase, then they whisper it in one person's ear, and then that person has to whisper it to the next person, and they whisper it to the next person, and to the next, all the way around the room, and then you hear what the person on the end of the chain says, what they heard. It sounds nothing at all like the original. That's what happens when you transmit oral stories, right? They get twisted over time. So, let's just take a look at those gospel accounts and see what we can know about, just say, one event. Let's just look at the resurrection, for example. The accounts of the resurrection are in all four Gospels. So, what day did Jesus die on? And what time of day? Was it the day after the Passover, as Mark clearly says, or the day before the Passover, as John clearly says? Was it at 9 a.m. in the morning, as Mark clearly says, or at noon, as in John? Did Jesus carry the cross the entire way, or was this man Simon the Cyrene enlisted to carry it for him? Who was the first to arrive at the empty tomb of Jesus? Was it Mary? Mary and some other women? Which women? Well, the list depends on which gospel you read. We have all these variations, and just in case you're wondering, you can find the actual verses that he's citing for these comparisons, and he posts them in his talks online. So he's not making these particular stories up. It appears that that is what's actually going on. When they arrived at the empty tomb, was the stone still in place, or had it been rolled away? Well, it depends on which gospel you read. Was there a man in the empty tomb, or an angel? Was it one angel or two angels? It all depends on which gospel you read. So what are we to do with all that? But actually, this evidence shows that there's a lot of internal contradiction here, but there's an even more fundamental reason why the New Testament is not to be believed. And that's presented by David Hume in this classic argument against miracles, where he makes this statement: no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the facts that it endeavors to establish. So you got that? For a miracle to be believable, it has to be more unbelievable that it's false than that it's true. Seems fairly reasonable on the surface. And this has led people like my friends Nabil and Zach and Daniel to conclude that the New Testament is not reliable, that the stories it tells are not true, and not to be trusted because there's so many internal contradictions. There's so much unreliability, so many unknowns here. What are we to do with all that? So, anybody ready to jettison your faith now? Just thought I'd check. Because anytime you hear an argument like this, and anytime you hear an argument and it sounds really compelling, I would always caution you to wait until you hear the other side. And this is true both for Christian arguments as well as for atheist arguments. A lot of times we make our arguments in a vacuum and they're not contested by the other side. And that can lead us to do some sloppy arguing for our case. And so I find some of the best formats are actually when you can have these genuine dialogues between atheists and Christians, or between Muslims and Christians, or Buddhists and Christians, or Odin worshippers and Christians. Who knew there were still Odin worshippers around anyways, really? Apparently, from what he tells me, being just pagan and just Wiccan wasn't cool enough. So he had to go for something a little fringier and chose to worship Odin. But this is what they came into the room with. But through the work of people like Mike Lycona and David Wood, helping them to work through each of these points raised and to address the concerns that were brought up, each of those three men became Christians who are currently raising families and raising their children up to know who Jesus is, because they could now get to know who Jesus was because they had evidence for the scriptures. And I'm trying to paint a picture here of why this subject is particularly important. See, no one can believe the content of the book unless they can believe in the author of the book and that the facts recorded are trustworthy and true. It may be a great story. We've read some fantastic stories. We've seen some great movies. But if we don't think that they're true, we're not going to take any action on it. And so, is there a case to be made that the New Testament is reliable? I just want to walk you through a few of the things that I've uncovered over some time. Now, this is not, I need to be honest with you. When I first joined this group, and these people were presenting their questions, I had what I think is probably a fairly typical Christian response. I've been to conferences like this, and I've heard 1 Peter 3:15. We should always be prepared to give a defense or a reason for the hope that we have, and to do so with gentleness and respect. So how am I going to give them a defense at this particular point in time? Well, I could go to 1 Timothy, where it says that all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching and correction. And that's really helpful if you already accept the Bible as true. But you very quickly realize, as soon as you bring this up to someone who doesn't accept the Bible as true, that what you're making, it seems to be to them to be a circular argument. You're trying to use the Bible to prove that the Bible is true, and it just falls flat very quickly for someone who doesn't accept that. So where can we start? Well, perhaps we can start from the place where a historian would start in examining the evidence, just as Bart Ehrman has done, and see what conclusions we might reach. See, here's a really good question to ask. And I'm just going to address a few things that we know about the documents that we have in our possession today. First of all, just in case you hadn't already heard, does anybody not already know, we don't have any of the original documents. Not one of the original writings in the New Testament. We don't have the original words as they were first penned. All we do have today are copies. But we have lots of copies that were made after the originals were written down. So if we were to survey documents of this time period, about 2,000 years ago, what might we find in terms of comparison? How many document copies exist for some of the most well-established documents of that time period? So here's a chart of just a few of them. You can see, and some of these names might be familiar to you. You may know about Plato and his tetralogies, for which we have 7 copies in existence today. Pliny the Younger's History, we have 7 copies. Caesar's Gallic Wars, we know a lot about Caesar, right? We have 7 copies in existence today of the original documents written about Caesar. It does get better than that, though. The story of Livy, as 20 manuscripts have survived through today. Sophocles, a whopping 193. But the best attested document, the second best attested document in history, is the Iliad by Homer, which many of us read when we were going through school. We have 643 copies in existence of Homer's Iliad. That's pretty cool, huh? That's pretty trustworthy when you have that many copies to look to. Some of you are a little bit nervous about the 0 over here in the last column right now. I had to do that for illustration purposes because now I want to show you the next slide, which has all these same numbers, but I'm going to fill in the gap on the New Testament. The copies of the New Testament that we have in existence today, there are over 6,300 in the original Greek. There are more than 10,000 in the Latin Vulgate manuscripts, and at least 9,300 other early versions in Ethiopic, Slavic, Armenian, or Arabic. Add all these together, and that's more than 25,000 copies that are still in existence today from antiquity. How does that stack up against the rest of these? Here's Homer's Iliad now on that chart. Paints a slightly different picture, doesn't it? Okay, let's ask a different question. How much time passed between the original account and the copies that we have today? I hope you understand what I'm saying. So the copy was perhaps written down this year, but the original doesn't survive. So how early is the earliest original that still survives today? Let's look at another chart. Plato's Tetralogies. The earliest copy we have was written down 1,200 years after the original. 1,200 years. Caesar's Gallic Wars. We all learn about Caesar and his conquest. But the earliest copy we have is 1,000 years, written down 1,000 years after the original events were recorded. Pliny's Histories gets a little better at 750 years. And even the remarkable Iliad by Homer, earliest copy we have is 500 years later than when it was originally written. And that is only a tiny fragment. Okay, so how does the New Testament stack up? You're looking over here at the far right. Only 50 years between when it was written down and the earliest copy we have. So here's a couple of examples for you. The John Ryland manuscript is dated to around the year AD 130. And this is believed to be the earliest fragment that exists, that we know about so far. As you can see, it's a pretty small fragment. It doesn't contain much, but it does have some of what's been identified in the book of John. Just a few years later, Bodmer Papyrus #2. These guys who classify these come up with these really interesting names. I don't know how they come up with this classification, but this is Bodmer Papyrus #2, dated somewhere between 150 and 200 AD. So here you have, still within, now when you consider that Jesus' death was 30 AD, but the books were probably written between 60 and 85, 90 AD, we still have roughly 100 years at most. And this contains large sections of the book of John. We also have the Chester Beatty Papyrus from 200 AD. And this one is remarkable because it's one of the earliest, nearly complete copies we have of most of the major portions of the New Testament. Now, remember that the New Testament wasn't originally circulated all as one big collection. It was actually circulated as a bunch of individual letters. But eventually, those letters were coalesced and circulated together and assembled into the form that we have today in the New Testament. And this is one of the earliest surviving copies of most of these books taken together. Again, we're looking at only a little over 100 years between when it was written down and the copies that we have today. Going a little further down the track, codex is a fancy word for a complete set of manuscripts all collected together. We would call it the Bible today, but originally these documents were called a codex, where they collected all these. And the very earliest one that we know about and still have in existence today is called Codex Sinaiticus. This has all of the New Testament collected together from AD 350. I actually had the privilege one time, I was at a conference much like this one up in Washington, D.C., and we happened to get word that there was a display at the Smithsonian down in the center of D.C. of some of this collection of these earliest documents. It was the biggest collection that had ever been assembled in one place. And I got to see firsthand these documents. It's remarkable to see them and think about how long they have survived. Because this is just paper and animal hide, not designed, if you know anything about paper, it's not designed to last thousands of years. It's barely designed to last 10 years. I find receipts fade after a few weeks if left out in the sun. But these documents have survived, and we still have access to them. Codex Alexandrinus, as you might guess from the name, is found near Alexandria in Egypt, and from the year 400 AD. And Codex Vaticanus. If you can work out your Latin there, you might see the root word Vatican, Vatican City. That's actually where the copy was found, was in Vatican City. Now, what's actually still amazing about these documents is these are the earliest ones we know about. But in monasteries and museums all over the world, there are tens of thousands of documents that have yet to even be analyzed, read, and classified. There could be many, many more out there, and every year more documents are discovered that build up this number. We just need some students who are willing to go do the translation and figure out what's on those documents, and those numbers may go up even more. We may find even earlier copies. So this is another way to look at the documents. What's another way we might think about documents? Well, one question you might ask is, how much variance exists between the copies that we have? Now, this gets into a field that is called textual criticism. And if you don't know what that means, that's fine. But really, it's just a way of, can I look at a bunch of different documents and analyze the differences between them and maybe kind of create sort of a family tree of these documents and see how they trace out. It's possible sometimes by perhaps one scribe made one little mistake and changed one character in a word, and then we see that in a whole line of documents afterwards. And we know that those documents were copied from these originals. Remember, there were no mimeograph machines, no photocopiers. Every one of these copies was made by hand. And so it is natural to expect that humans, being fallible, might make some mistakes in the copying. And so we could ask this question, how much distortion exists? Distortion is a measure of this variability between the different copies that exist today. So here's three different documents from around that time period. One of them is an Indian document. I actually can't tell you much about it. I should have done a little bit more research on it. But it's actually from that time period. It has, trying to read the numbers here. I should look behind me. 10% of the document is distorted. It varies by at least 10% from copy to by up to 10% between the copies. The Homer's Iliad, which we refer to, is greatly preserved for us and has about half of that, about 5% of it is distorted. But the New Testament has 0.2% distortion. Now, you might look at that and get a little worried, because even 2% is a little bit worrisome if you are accepting the whole New Testament as what's the word?
Inspired.
Yeah, inspired, or as
infallible?
Yeah, infallible, that's the word. Thank you very much. Come up here and do my job for me, because I can't think of the words here. If you accept it as inspired and infallible, what are you going to do with this when there's some variations? Well, this is part of where that textual criticism comes in. We can actually trace back through those. But I want to tell you a few things about those variations. There are literally tens of thousands of them. Okay, that's the bad news. Tens of thousands of variations between the copies of the New Testament. But do you know, almost every single one of those is just a very minor variation in spelling or phraseology. See, a scribe's job is really tough copying those words over one at a time. In fact, they would often ignore the words and try to copy letter for letter what was on the page, because when you're looking at whole words and sentences, you often see what you think you see rather than what's actually there. But by focusing on just one character at a time, then you've got a better chance of preserving it. But if you make a slight mistake in Greek, you might change one letter into another, but without even realizing it. Or the guy behind you might make a copy and say, oh, did he just drop his pen there, or is that meant to be this other character? And so then he copies what he thinks he sees. And these can creep in to some of the copies that travel through time. So you can go online and you can research all these variations yourself, but I just wanted to give you one example to give you an idea of what type of variation we're talking about. And this is actually one of the bigger variations that I found in the list. It comes from Matthew chapter 14, verse 26. In 4 different copies, we find 4 slightly different phrases. The Greek there, and the white and the yellow below it is the English translation. And the first one says, and upon seeing him, the disciples. The second one, and upon seeing him. Third, but the disciples upon seeing him. And the fourth is, but upon seeing him. So between the second and fourth, we have the difference between and but. Which actually, there's a Greek word that can mean both, which can get a little confusing. I don't know if that was the particular word that was used in this case. But you see that it looks like somewhere along the way, it's possible someone either dropped the phrase, the disciples. That seems unlikely. But more likely, somebody might have added it in there for just a little bit of clarity around who is the, but upon seeing him, who are they talking about? So some scribe somewhere along the way may have been well-meaning. He may even put it in the margin. And here's where some of these errors really creep in. They can find some documents where the scribes wrote notes in the margins, but some scribe later on thought, I better make sure I copy those notes too. Well, the notes were never meant to be part of the original text that was copied, but it got added in. A lot of times today, Christians pick up the Bible and open it up and see all the chapters and verse headings, and they think, those must have been written in the original text. Nope. There's no chapters and verses. Those were added later just to help us with breaking it up into bits and being able to reference it. Your headings, even, are not there in the original text. Those are things that different translators have added to help us. And all of our translations we have today do a good job of explaining up front which parts are the actual text and which parts are added. So you can see sometimes these variations do creep in. But does it change in any way, shape, or form the meaning of that phrase? No, not in the slightest. There's only two large variants that we know about. Two large strands of verses that exist in some copies and don't exist in others. And in fact, we now know from tracing these family trees that some of the earliest copies don't have these verses. And I bet if you go look it up in your Bible today, you'll probably find a footnote to that effect. Either these verses will have been moved into the footnotes, or they'll be highlighted and a big footnote placed below them. The two stories are somewhat familiar to most of us who spend any time reading the Bible. One is a story everybody loves to tell. It's about the story of the woman who's caught in adultery, brought out before, and the Jewish leaders say to Jesus, "What should we do with her? She was caught in adultery. Let's stone her." And then he starts scribbling in the ground, and something happens. We don't know what he scribbled. Maybe it was their sins. It's a really wonderful story, isn't it? They hear the story, and they see what he scribbled, and they go away. We love the story, but it's not actually in the oldest copies. Does that mean it couldn't have been? We don't know. We don't actually have the originals, but it seems unlikely that it was in the originals. It might have been a commonly told story that was in circulation that got written down. The other large variant that we have is at the tail end of the book of Mark. Mark chapter 16 ends with what some people call the long ending of Mark, verses 9 through 20. And these verses actually don't exist in the earliest copies of Mark. But there's a small problem with Mark, actually. Some of the earliest copies we have are actually all frayed at the end. So it's actually not certain whether or not there was an ending on it or not. So it's possible that earlier copies had it, but it seems unlikely based on the best evidence that we have today. Some people confronted with this kind of variation get a little squirmy and go, wow, that's really bad news that there's variations. I think it's great news that we can do this kind of research and actually figure out what these variations and where they may have come from. And we can have confidence because of the type of variations that exist. They don't change in any way. Not one variant changes in any way any significant theological point. And they barely even change the meanings of the words as you find them, with the exception of these two larger bits that are not found in the earliest manuscripts. So one of the questions that we want to ask is, well, why isn't there actually more variants than that? But since we're relying on humans' copy, and we talked about what happens when you do the whispering game, you're making copies and copies and copies. Well, these guys were very careful when they're doing their copies. And one of the things we have to remember is Christianity spread very rapidly around the Mediterranean. This shows the spread of Christianity just in the first 300 years. it spread so rapidly and into other regions where it was translated into other languages that some of the earliest copies we have are actually translations into those other languages. So before we even had a chance for distortions to creep in, we've already got copies being made in other languages. And we can use those to kind of reconcile back to the originals and say, this is how we can do some of this analysis. And it gives us great confidence that the text is faithfully preserved, that these variants are so minor as to be virtually negligible. All this came about because these people were going around preaching what they had seen. And they were telling the stories of what they had seen, and then many people were going on writing it down. This is just a short list of many of the early church fathers who've written down some of the New Testament in their own writings. So they copy a couple of verses in and then give some explanation of it. If you were to take all of the early church fathers' writings, let's say we didn't have any of those 25,000 manuscripts of the original New Testament, all we had was the early church fathers. How much of the New Testament do you think we could reassemble just from their quotes that they put together, that we could pull out of their writings? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
60?
60? Pretty good. That would be really impressive. We can actually pull together 98% of the New Testament from these guys, the quotes of these guys alone. And that's pretty staggering. Now, I want to return briefly to historians' criteria that Bart Ehrman mentioned at the beginning. So we talked about some of the ways that we can know whether or not documents from this time period are trustworthy. Another friend of mine, Mike Lycona, put together the list this way. This is some of the major criteria that we want to use. And I actually try to remember this as a sentence. This helps me remember the 5 areas that we want to look at. Multiple eyewitnesses, embarrassed early enemies. It doesn't make much sense as a sentence, but here are those criteria laid out. We want to have multiple copies. As Bart Ehrman said, we want as many copies as possible. What do we have? 25,000 in existence compared to much, much smaller numbers. Now the question of eyewitnesses, I'll get back to this in just a minute. But we have really good reason to believe that some of these documents were written by the names of the people we have attributed to them. And I'll just get back to that in just a moment. Embarrassing. So if there's something in the documents that would be embarrassing to the people who the stories are being told about, it's very unlikely that it was made up. And a perfect example of this is the fact that women were the first to find the tomb of Jesus empty. Because in that particular time period, you're looking at a culture where women's testimony was not considered particularly highly regarded and not to be trusted. So if you're going to make up a story about finding the tomb empty, you would not put a woman as the first person to find it if you were going to make it up. So the only reason it could be there is because it's true. It's embarrassing. If you look at Mark, for example, if you read through there, so many of the stories that Mark tells about Peter, really embarrassing about Peter. Why would he say such things about Peter? Well, turns out Mark was actually a disciple of Peter's and took notes on what Peter had to say. Peter was telling the stories about himself. And why would he tell these embarrassing stories about himself? Because they actually happened that way. Yes, it's embarrassing that it happened, that I didn't believe her when she first came and knocked on the door. It's embarrassing that I went and hid when Jesus was crucified, and only after I saw him resurrected could I come out. There's so much that's embarrassing in there. Nobody would make up a story about themselves and paint themselves that way on purpose. And finally, we have the testimony of enemies. See, if someone who's not a friend of Christianity corroborates something that Christianity is saying, it gives a much higher likelihood that it's true. For example, the Jews of the time said that the disciples stole the body. Okay, Jews are no friend of Christians. Why would they be saying the disciples stole the body? It seems very likely they were saying that because the tomb was empty, because they were saying this in Jerusalem where they could have gone and examined the tomb. If it wasn't empty, there would be no reason to tell a story that the disciples stole the body. There would be no story to tell. You just say, no, there he is, just go over there and look. So we have these stories from people who are not friends to Christians. One of the other things, so if you consider these criteria in context now for just a second, and think about what Bart Ehrman was saying there at the very beginning. Now we looked at some of the criteria, and we looked at what Bart Ehrman feels about these documents, that they shouldn't be trusted because they were written down so far after the events, and that we have these translations of translations. Well, if his argument is valid, the fact is we know nothing of ancient history. Absolutely nothing, because every other document we have from this time period has far less support for the trustworthiness of the translations the copies that exist today, and that it's been faithfully preserved. We would know nothing, and his job would be vanished because there's no work to do as a historian if you can't take anything as true from any of these documents. But based on his criteria, many historians have actually come to believe that people like Luke was one of the best historians of ancient times and did a tremendous job of recording the text for us of what actually happened at that time. Let's think about what Luke did in his biography of Jesus and how it sets apart from other stories you might read. In Luke chapter 3, verse 1, he says this: "In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene." That's a whole lot of detail that nobody would put into a made-up story. It's all verifiable. Now, there have been some debates over the years about whether or not it has been verified, because for a long time we couldn't find evidence of some of these people. Archaeology just hadn't discovered it. But, and I don't even have time to go into the archaeological evidence in support of this, but archaeology has time and time again found more evidence that corroborates the stories that we know about, that have been preserved, about who these people were and what time periods they lived. Even when the Bible was being read by these scholars, they had no other reason to believe it other than that it was recorded in the Bible. Now the archaeology is coming around and supporting that. And when he's writing down things like this, we need to remember that there's not enough time for, some people say that this is all kind of legendized over time. That's not even a word. I'm just making one up. So it's become a legend because people keep retelling these stories and they get better and better as time goes on. But researchers who study the field of legend development know that 40 to 100 years is not enough time. You need a minimum of 3 generations for these kind of legends to creep in, and we can see that kind of evolution occurring in other documents, that legends do creep in about some people from the past. None of these documents were written down later than 70 AD. That meant people were still alive who could corroborate the contents of the documents. Paul's letters are even earlier than the New Testament biographies of Jesus, from 49 to 65 AD, and they talk about Jesus' death and resurrection. Here's another thing that historians will look for. An anachronism is like if you're watching a movie about King Arthur's court, and you happen to catch a glimpse of one of the characters in the story, and he's got a watch on. You go, hang on a second, that ain't right. They didn't have watches back then. That's an anachronism. That's something that doesn't belong because it's actually from a later time period. And if a story is being written down much, much later, these anachronisms inevitably creep in. People make references to something that's in their past, but for the time period of the story, it's still in the future, and so it couldn't be true. When you examine the text of the New Testament, you don't find these. Probably should mention one exception. One of the reasons the dates are given for many of the books of the biographies of Jesus as after 70 AD is because, do you know what a significant event occurred in 70 AD? Yeah, the destruction of the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Well, in several of the biographies of Jesus, he predicts the destruction of the temple. Well, if you don't accept the fact that he made a prediction, then you have to place that date after the destruction of the temple so that you can rectify it in your mind as, okay, he's writing the events after the fact, and they've written in this time. So skeptical scholars set those dates beyond 70 AD because of that event. Other scholars who are willing to accept the possibility that maybe he actually said it before it occurred would place the dates much earlier than that, and that would get us even closer to the time of the events. I want to briefly mention probably a piece of historical evidence that makes historians drool. And you probably have read over this a number of times in the past and not even noticed what it was. This text comes from Paul's letter to the Corinthians in chapter 15, where he's talking about the death of Jesus and how we can have confidence in our resurrection because of his. But in verses 3 to 8, it has this peculiar set of verses. He says, I passed on to you what was the most important, was also been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the Scripture said. He was buried and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the Scriptures said. He was seen by Peter and then the 12. This is what historians would call a creed, and that kind of pattern of something and then just as the Scripture said, something and just as the Scripture said, is a symptom of something being a creed. It's a mnemonic, a way of remembering something and making it easy to remember. Paul is saying, I received this information and I'm passing it on to you. When did he receive it? And I could go into a lengthy description of why historians have come to this conclusion, but many historians actually believe Paul received this. Paul converted to Christianity just 3 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. He went to Jerusalem just 3 years after that to meet with the other disciples. That is the most likely time period. And he went there to confirm that what he was teaching was the same as what they were teaching. And so that is most likely when he received this creed that they were saying and passing around to remind people of exactly what Christians believed. So this creed is probably from within 6 years of the resurrection of Jesus. This makes historians drool because we have nothing else, nothing that comes even remotely close to that closeness to the time of the events. We're used to the modern age where events happen and a few seconds later around the world we found out about it because of the internet. But that's not true of ancient history. This is gold for historians. Now, I mentioned these early church fathers who recorded much of what we have today for us. But I want to address some of how we know what we know about who wrote these books. There's two different early church fathers who wrote down some information that still exists today. And this first quote is from Papias. And Papias actually knew the Apostle John. And he says, the elder, Apostle John, used to say this also. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that Peter mentioned, whether sayings or doings of Christ, not however in order. He was neither a hearer nor a companion of the Lord. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter. So then Mark made no mistake, for he paid attention to this one thing, not to omit anything that he had heard, nor to include any false statements among it. So Mark's following Peter around for years, writing everything down as best as he can. But he's not concerning himself, as a modern historian would, with getting it all in chronological order. And this is the point I want to get to, and I'll come back to in a minute. But let's just look at one other one. See, some people have questioned Papias because he has one other writing that's just slightly crazy. He's talking about how Judas, after he killed himself, went off to other parts of the world to go talk about Jesus, and people question Papias' sanity because of that. Well, okay, let's say Papias is not trustworthy. Do we have any other sources? I'm getting off into some of the weeds here of what historians look at. See, you can spend a lifetime studying this, and I have friends who've done just this. Mike Lycona wrote his PhD thesis on this kind of evidence and spent 5 years doing careful research to uncover some of this information. But we have another early church father, Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. So you have this direct lineage of these people had firsthand encounters with the apostles. And this is what Irenaeus had to say. Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own tongue when Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in the book of the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, himself produced his gospel while he was living in Ephesus in Asia. So how do we get the names that are associated with the books that we have in there today? Well, we have this faithfully transmitted information. Why didn't they sign it? Well, we don't know, but it just wasn't all that common for people to sign their own works in that time period. But we have reliably transmitted information on who wrote them and when. And we know that at least two of those, Matthew and John, were first-hand eyewitnesses. Mark spent a lot of time following Peter around getting his first-hand account. So we have eyewitnesses. Now, I just want to quickly shoot through one last area. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to probably take some of this up in the question and answer period afterwards if you want to spend more time on it. But so here's quickly are 5 sources that we know about that are not Christian sources that also talk about the existence of Jesus. And all of this is in the outline that I'm giving you there. These are non-Christian sources who write about either the death, the burial, or resurrection of Jesus. So we have additional support for what we have written down in the New Testament from unfavorable sources. But what about those contradictions? Now, I brought a book along with me today that's written by my friend Mike Lyconen. It's just been published this past year. And the title of the book is, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And what Mike did was spend quite a bit of time researching ancient Near East biographies. These are stories about people written from the time period that the Gospels were written down. And he wanted to see what he could learn from studying those. And he chose a particular author to focus on called Plutarch. Plutarch wrote a lot of biographies, and they're recorded in lives. And among these biographies, sometimes he tells the same stories multiple times. And you can actually see from one person how he retells the story in different ways, in different times. And I just want to highlight a few of the things that Mike discovered during his reading that make some really interesting illumination on the text of the New Testament. Some of these tricky areas that we talk about and sometimes are referred to as contradictions. So, first of all, we have to know the difference between differences and contradictions. Sometimes somebody chooses to focus on just a particular area, and so the fact that they choose to omit a piece of information doesn't mean it wasn't present. But it just wasn't important to the person who was writing it down at that particular time. But some of the other interesting features he found were a thing called telescoping. Telescoping is when you tell a story that maybe occurred over 3 days, but you tell it as if it occurred in just one. And you do this because you want to focus on the central features of the story, and the fact that it occurred over 3 days really isn't that relevant to the story. One of the Gospels talks about when Jesus would go into Jerusalem, cursed a tree, and then on the way back out of Jerusalem, the disciples saw that it was dead and marveled at it. In another Gospel, it says, he cursed it and it died. No time period passed in between. This exact same feature of telescoping is sometimes used by the New Testament authors. And it doesn't mean that they were being inaccurate. In fact, we have to carefully consider, are we looking at their histories through modern eyes, where we do try to put things in chronological order? Or are we looking at through Near Eastern biographers' eyes, where they were more concerned about telling you about the character of a person? And so they would tell stories grouped by a particular character attribute. And this explains many of the differences we see in some of the ordering of the Gospels. So I don't have the time to tell you about all of these, but I think it's a fascinating study that I encourage you to read if you're curious about that. I don't hear that particular topic raised as often here in New Zealand, but it's a big hot topic back in the States where I come from about these contradictions. And a lot of people will use that to jettison the whole text of the New Testament. So it can be a really important area that can come up when people begin to study this more carefully. But finally, I just want to take us back to my original point. The reason all of this matters, the reason I came to study this so carefully is because I saw the effect that it had on my three friends. Because they could now trust that the text had been faithfully transmitted, they were willing to listen to the stories told by the text of who Jesus was, what he had done, and the impact think about the impact that has on us today. And to be able to see three lives transformed and commit their lives to Christ for all eternity was so precious to me that I decided to learn from that myself. I'm going to be upstairs for some Q&A on this and other topics right after I leave here. And if you have more questions, please come up there and ask those questions. And thank you for listening today.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please consider supporting us to get more content just like this. Visit support.thinkingmatters.org.nz or click on the link in the description. If you really enjoyed this topic and would like to go further in depth, I would recommend purchasing 77 Facts About God and the Bible by Josh and Sean McDowell. 77 Facts offers a concise, accessible presentation that readers want and need in an apologetics resource. Answers they'll turn to in everyday life. We stock this book in our online store, which you can find a link to in the description.